ladies and gentlemen, and thank you so much for joining me for Weather Center's first ever Morning Metcon. This is where we'll take some time to take a look at what the weather looks like across the United States for the day today, as well as what's going on out in the tropics. Getting started with National Hurricane Center's homepage, Hurricane Lee has made very little change over the last 24 hours. His maximum sustained winds are still at about 115, which does continue to make him a major hurricane, but his minimum central pressure at 948 has changed very little over the last 24 hours. It still looks fairly organized overall on satellite imagery, and he has slowed down about 3 miles an hour in comparison to yesterday. He was moving north at about 9. Today's analysis indicates he's slowed down to a whopping 6 miles per hour, still moving off to the north and northwest. Hurricane Margot's lowest central pressure continues to deepen. We've seen a steady deepening trend over the last 18 to 24 hours, down to 975 millibars in the center of circulation. Her sustained winds have yet to catch up. We're still sitting at about 85 miles per hour, which makes her a solid Category 1 hurricane. A couple of the intensity guidance models want to bring this up to Category 2. However, I don't foresee this happening as she continues to transcend the upper latitudes of the North Atlantic, moving further and further into those more unfavorable conditions for further intensification. The plus side is if she does try to cross that threshold into Category 2, she is no substantial threat to any populated area, so we can essentially sit back and watch as this system continues to evolve. Last but certainly not least, out in the main development region, the Eastern Atlantic, we have disturbance number 1, AL97L, with an elevated chance of 40% development over the next 48 hours. Across the next 7 days, we have an 80% chance that this will develop into our next named system, i.e. Nigel, which we've been talking about on Weather Center Nazario for the last few days. It still looks a little ragged out on infrared. We are starting to see some overnight convection pop up closest to its center, which could hopefully shroud it from all the exposed elements we saw during the day yesterday and the day prior. You could see where the lowest point in the low was actually completely exposed with no significant thunderstorm activity to help reinforce it. If this could change today and it finally gets some of that thunderstorm activity to wrap around its vortex, we could start to see a deepening trend over the next 24-48 hours as NHC is indicating. Moving right along to the water vapor image, we're looking at a pretty large area of the northern hemisphere. You can see Hurricane Lee and Margot essentially spinning in unison. Wonderful to look at this morning on satellite imagery. Over the United States, you can see that we have a fairly meridional long wave pattern, which means that the jet is kind of moving in an up and down or a trough ridge trough kind of orientation across much of North America. There's a good finger of the jet working its way into the base of our mature wave over James Bay, Upper Great Lakes in the northeast quadrant of the United States, eastern Canada. We can also see that there's another frontal system beginning to make its way through the Pacific Northwest, supported by the same polar front, also beginning to impact the weather in the Intermountain West Great Basin area. You can actually see some textbook cross-barrier flow if you look real closely on the water vapor satellite. I'll get my ink out of the way. There's some cross-barrier flow occurring along the Rocky Mountain Range in central Montana. This leading frontal boundary over here is leading the charge in terms of providing some significant shower and storm coverage for the northeast and mid-Atlantic states. This is the same frontal boundary that's expected to propel a little further to the south and southeast, elevating our chances for increased showers and storm coverage as we go over the next couple of days. So if you live in the southern states or along the Gulf Coast and you're looking for some reprieve from the dry conditions we've had over the last few days, it's coming, I promise. Throughout the night last night, there was a bit of a weak shortwave trough working its way through the desert southwest, which amplified overnight thunderstorm activity for their area as well. In fact, if we take a look at the National Weather Service Mosaic radar, you can see the northeast is seeing widespread showers and storms induced by that mature frontal system that I mentioned on the water vapor image. There's some of that nocturnal shower activity continuing for the desert southwest, inundating most of central and south New Mexico, spanning eastward into Texas, parts of Louisiana, Arkansas, and even the southern periphery of Oklahoma. Yesterday, we did have another round of thunderstorm activity for interior parts of the Florida Peninsula. Those have since weakened with a few lingering showers off the coastline. And if you look real close over Montana, Idaho, and parts of northwestern Wyoming, there are also some light returns associated with that next unstable wave or baroclinic low that's working its way across the northern tier United States. Finally, as we descend down to the surface, this is our latest surface analysis. You can see the aforementioned front, one draped across eastern United States down into the Gulf Coast, a stationary boundary that I do anticipate is going to wash out with the approach of our next unstable wave, and then the next one that's actually going to provide some higher terrain snow possibly for the Intermountain West Central Rockies as it continues to propagate off to the east. This southern periphery of the frontal boundary draped across eastern Conus is expected to pick up some forward momentum as Hurricane Lee begins to interact with its line of temperature discontinuity and pull it further south into the southeastern United States, which is likely to increase overall coverage of rain and isolated thunderstorm activity as we go through the later parts of this week and into the weekend. Alrighty, this wouldn't be a Morning Metcon if we didn't look and see what the near-distant future has in store for us. So we're looking at the 12-kilometer NAM, a little bit more higher res so we can get a feel for what this afternoon and overnight tonight looks like. We're expecting that we'll see an increase in thunderstorm coverage, especially as that mature wave continues to propagate eastward over the northeast. You can see that a large majority of Connecticut, Pennsylvania, even even areas of greater New York, Maine, New Jersey, Boston area are looking at the chances for shower and thunderstorm activity with elevated winds as that front continues to move through the area. All that cold air advection back behind it is going to increase surface winds just a little bit, especially once Hurricane Lee can get its act together and begin to finally position itself off the northeastern coastline and influence the weather that much more. Since we're still under monsoonal conditions over the desert southwest Four Corners area, it looks like we could see another resurgence of daytime showers and storms for them as well as we get through max heating of the day. Between 18 Zulu and about 23 to 0 Z, we'll finally see it start to taper off. There is a pocket of more isolated, stronger convection that could push through the panhandles of Texas and Oklahoma as we go through the afternoon, early evening hours of today. For those of you watching along the Gulf Coast, southeastern United States, you can also see the NAM is picking up for some widespread showers and storms induced by that stationary tail that's sitting overhead. This is likely going to continue and persist throughout today, tomorrow, and through the weekend as that front can start to move in a more southerly fashion. And before we wrap up, folks, I wanted to go ahead and cover CPC's latest graphic for tropical cyclone development. Currently, they are highlighting a 20% if not greater chance of development over the east and central Atlantic, which is indicative of our AL97 out there we talked about at the beginning of Metcon, but it looks like they're trying to expand our source regions a little bit as we start to move into early October. The Western Caribbean and parts of the Gulf of Mexico, Bay of Campeche also look like they could be conducive for tropical cyclone development, especially once we get into the spooky month of October. It goes without saying, since we're on the trailing end at this point of the peak of hurricane season, as soon as we get to that late September, early October timeframe, the MDR and Central Atlantic are prime for decent tropical cyclone development because we'll be in an oscillating pattern to where we'll see a little bit more upward vertical motion in our atmospheric dynamics as opposed to some of the areas that are currently being smothered in terms of our North Atlantic and Madden-Julian oscillation. Alrighty, my lovely viewers, that just about wraps up today's Morning Metcon. Happy Hump Day. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you later this evening for the full episode of Weather Center Nazario. We'll talk to you soon.